log in. If you haven't, we'll be monitoring the chat so people can tell us if there's any problems. So good evening anyway, and welcome to this first webinar by EBSWA, the Evidence-Based Social Work Alliance. My name's Maggie Mellon and I'm your chair for this evening. EBSWA was formed late in 2020 by social workers in practice and teaching in England and Scotland, and who found ourselves concerned about and in conflict with the rapid capture of social work policy and practice by belief in something called gender identity. So we wanted evidence before adopting any such belief, and we set ourselves the aim of gathering and promoting evidence and insisting on an evidence-informed debate. So we're delighted to have such a great attendance of nearly 200 people, we hope, for our first event this evening. It's being recorded and it will be shared more widely. So tonight's event on children and consent could not be more timely, coming as it does on the heels of the appeal court ruling on the Kira Bell case. And we're going to hear from our speakers on what that ruling might mean in practice and on related issues. So just a few words before we start on how the session will run, or how we plan it will run. This is our first attempt at a webinar, so it feels a bit like a higher wire act without a net at the moment. So please bear with us with any glitches. I'm going to introduce the speakers and then I'm going to move on to the presentations. The speakers will each speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions and discussion. All the speakers have promised to keep within time so that there will be discussion, and we will finish promptly at 8:30. You can submit questions anytime by using the button at the base of the screen, Q&A, or in the chat, I suppose. We're going to have it moderated. We have to have everyone on mute on events like these are liable to disruption by people who don't like evidence or debate. We would like nothing more than not to have to do that, but that is the way things are just now. So our first speaker, and I need to say a few words about that, is Social Work Anon. Now, Social Work Anon is a qualified social worker and he's a member of EBSWA with an interest in child development and how it intersects with gender ideology. I need to say something here about his anonymity. Social Work Anon will be known to many of you by his Twitter commentary. His anonymity tonight has been made necessary by what I would call the shameful conduct of Social Work England, the social work regulator for England. Despite the Forstater ruling making clear that gender critical views are legitimate and protected, they have investigated social workers on complaints of transphobia for not believing and not accepting beliefs in gender identity. And they have now disciplined a social worker for merely supporting gender critical views on her own personal social media accounts, not for discrimination against anyone or any other breach of professional ethics, but for holding and expressing a legitimate belief. So we believe they'll have to roll back on that. We don't intend to accept the position, and we will invite you all to help us challenge Social Work England. We'll maybe have them along to a future webinar to explain their position. But unfortunately, investigation alone is enough to blight careers and lose employment. And that's why Social Work Anon has got to be anonymous tonight, and not for any other reason, because investigations are a punishment in themselves. So without any more ado, I'm going to invite Social Work Anon to address us, and then we'll move on to the other speakers. So over to you, Social Work.
Good evening. Could you hear me?
Yes.
Cool. Right. Good evening, everyone. I've got quite a long presentation here, so I'm going to run through quite a bit. But I will be posting on the EBSWA website afterwards in case you miss some parts of it. It's entitled "Child Development Theory: An Inconvenient Truth for Gender Affirmation Treatment." Many of us intuitively know that the gender affirmation treatment model with a trans child at its heart is wrong, but lack evidence around child development theory to easily debunk its claims and show it for what it is. a formerly well-meaning experimental treatment pathway that has been turned into an industry by those with ulterior motives. The following piece will scrutinize the assertions underpinning gender affirmation treatment through the lens of child development theory and show that 1, no child has an innate and immutable gender identity. 2, rather that gender is a social construct around which children constantly adapt. 3, desistance from gender dysphoria is a natural part of child development. And 4, puberty blockers are actually gender conversion. We will start with the key fiction at the heart of this enterprise, the immutable and innate gender identity. Part 1 is called Searching for the Loci of Gender Identity in the Child. When analysed through the lens of child development theory, it becomes clear that there is no settled science to support the central and underpinning tenet of gender ideology, that a child has an innate, immutable gender identity. So even strong advocates, such as Jack Turban, have to admit that, quote, the precise etiology of gender identity has yet to be identified. Likewise, a literature review in the Endocrinal Metabolism Clinic, North America, from 2019 concluded this was no genetic loci or specific neuroanatomic regions have been consistently identified as a single explanation for transgender identity. This came from a literature review of all the evidence. So it's not just one person. They've looked like mad for this thing. In other words, there is no settled scientific evidence that the immutable gender identity exists in the brain. It is an ideological assertion, a mere unproven hypothesis. Part 2. If it's not inside the child, where does gender originate? Perhaps surprisingly, the WHO is clear. It describes gender as, quote, the characteristics of women and men that are socially constructed, while sex refers to those that are biologically determined. In other words, it is an external social construct. It continues, people are born female or male, but learn to be girls and boys who grow up into women and men. This learned behavior makes up gender identity and determines gender roles. So even the WHO, which can certainly be regarded as a trans-friendly organization, sees gender as an external social construct that is learned rather than an innate, immutable, soul-like thing. Part 3, child development theories. So the social construction of gender neatly leads to Piaget, Goldberg, Bandura, Michel, Erickson, etc. These scientists studied child development through the 20th century. Their findings have changed the way we regard all aspects of childhood, from principles of childcare through pediatric healthcare to education. It is their research that has created childhood as we know it now. Their empirical research unequivocally shows that gender is an external force or structure, and that is one of the many which impacts on and can be internalized by the child and adolescent as they grow, due to cognitive changes and social learning processes. So, due to time constraints, I will focus on 2 of these theorists, Jean Piaget and Lawrence Goldberg. So Piaget split the cognitive developmental stages of children into 4 main stages: the sensory motor stage, the pre-operational stage, concrete operational stage, and the formal operational stage, which is from ages 12 and up. According to Piaget's theory, how a 5-year-old in the pre-operational phase regards their gender is very different to that of a 9-year-old in the operational phase. Why? In the simplest terms, it is because their brain and their cognitive processes have developed and matured. The 9-year-old will have a different cognitive processes and have an enhanced schema, another term of Piaget's, which will have adapted to absorb and work with different information, including gender structures. This model is worth bearing in mind when considering why the vast majority of children desist from gender dysphoria. In the process of desisting, the gender dysphoric child simply will have gone through the natural cognitive developmental processes and grown out of a previous childish phase and schema of gender, the very process that puberty blockers are prescribed to prevent. This theory also explains why these drugs invariably lead to the next stage of cross-sex hormones. The child's natural maturation process is blocked by these drugs, such that they are unable to form new cognitive pathways and schemas to move their lives on. They have been imprisoned in a developmental stage by chemical blockers and cannot mature out of it. It is why I regard puberty blockers as a form of conversion therapy. There's more on that later. Lawrence Goldberg suggested there were 3 stages that children went through in the process of developing gender or sex constancy. First, gender labeling. Second was gender stability or sex stability, indeed. And third was gender or sex constancy. I won't go through those for the time, but just to give you an indication of there's a lot of changes that he also saw the children went through. And I'll just go for the last one. Children, gender constancy. Children can understand gender consistency a more sophisticated level of constancy than gender or sex stability. Gender sex constancy refers to the understanding that despite superficial changes, a boy will remain a boy and a girl will remain a girl. For example, even if a boy wears a dress, he will still remain a boy. His sex remains the same. Time precludes giving a complete rundown on the works of Bandura and Michel, as well as works of Erik Erikson. All of these are highly pertinent. All of them show the same thing, that childhood is a time of great change and enterprise. The child's relationship to all aspects of their life revolves and flexes. It is also worth noting that if an immutable gender identity existed, it would have been uncovered by these scientists, not least because it would have been the only part of a child that remained unchanged from birth to adulthood, i.e. the part, in fact, from inside the uterus, i.e. the part of the child with the fully formed adult gender consciousness within it. In effect, they would have found a person's immortal soul around which all other aspects of development revolve like stars around the planet. Part 4. What this means, pathologizing gender discomfort. So if existing evidence shows that gender originates outside the body of the child, i.e. is a social construct, then the ethical and evidence-based treatment for gender dysphoria must also take this key consideration into account. It cannot ignore it and decide instead to concentrate on just fixing the body of the child. But that is precisely what gender affirmation treatment seeks to achieve. It internalizes and pathologizes the discomfort between the gender dysphoric child and their body and attempts to fix it by making the body more like that of the childish image. It ignores both the external factors that impact on the child's sense of their own gender and developmental phases a child goes through. The message that comes from gender affirmative treatment is that it is the child who needs to fix their gender distress rather than we as a society who have created these uncomfortable constructs which cause the distress. We should be asking, why is society, why so many children and adolescents feel uncomfortable with their gender? Why the huge increase in girls being referred to Tavistock in recent years? Whatever happened to gender non-conforming kids? Why do teenage girls feel so uncomfortable coming out as lesbian? Perhaps we should concentrate on the social construct that creates these conditions. But no, we choose to ignore the external and instead pathologize children, as it is easier to medicalize children than look at what is wrong in our society. Part 5, ignoring comorbidities. In addition, and unforgivably, by focusing just on internal feelings about gender, gender affirmation treatment ignores underlying comorbidities. So the trauma of a 5-year-old girl who was sexually abused and now wants to be a boy to protect herself through a process of magical thinking is to be ignored. She is just a trans child. Homosexuality and homophobia, autism, toxic family dynamics, and many other factors leading children to feel discomfort with their bodies and or their peer group are similarly ignored because the solution is always to affirm gender. We are looking at 21st century snake oil treatment for a very 21st century Western social problem. And if as a practitioner, I try and work with these comorbidities, I am indulging in conversion therapy. Part 6, enter conversion therapy, gender conversion therapy. To quote Stonewall, gender conversion therapy seeks to, and there's a long bit of sentence for it, but ends up suppress a person's gender identity. There's a quote, you can find that on Stonewall website. As far as we have seen, due to continuous cognitive developments, the child's sense of their gender is far from fixed. So I'd argue, considering this knowledge, that suppression now takes the form of preventing the next stage of cognitive and thus gender development taking place. Thus, the role of puberty blocking drugs to suppress gender development that would naturally occur. In other words, gender affirmation treatment becomes a form of conversion therapy when it suppresses the natural cognitive and physical developments of the child. Through puberty blockers, adults halt the development of the child's sense of gender at a stage that suits them before the child can properly understand and consent to what is being done. So, in summary, there is no evidence that a child has an innate and immutable gender that needs to be affirmed. That is not to dispute that children with painful and persistent gender dysphoria exist and need treatment. Rather, it is to state that the source of their pain is external to them and originates in the social constructs we have created and which they have internalized. A child's development of a sense of gender is fluid and dynamic, responsive to cognitive and social changes like all other aspects of childhood development. In this context, desistance from gender dysphoria is an expected outcome from rapidly developing cognitive processes as well as social learning. Puberty blockers prevent that natural desistance occurring. A prepubescent child can have no conception of what their future gender iterations might be. They have no idea what adult they might develop into. Their cognitive, developmental, and social learning cannot support such hypothesizing. How can they predict the life and loves of their teenage 20, 30, and 50-year-old selves? How can they know these iterations will fit into a society as yet unformed? The trajectory of their life is being altered forever now to affirm the belief system of the adults around them. And once again, the arguments for bodily autonomy for children, this time to promote the use of puberty blockers, are being used to facilitate what is, for many children, child abuse. Finally, without the crux of an immutable gender identity, there is no defense for gender affirmative approach for children. In fact, for most gender dysphoric or questioning children, this intervention is a cruel con trick which pathologizes their discomfort, which would naturally resolve anyway due to cognitive development, ignores their comorbidities, and will lead to lifelong medical interventions. It is tantamount to conversion therapy in the terms of the definition provided by Stonewall. Have I got one more minute, Maggie? Yeah, I'm going to go ahead. I can't hear you, so I'm just going to professionally ignore you. Postscript.
You do. Go ahead.
Okay. Our response to the challenge of gender ideology is a mess. Instead of seeing gender for what it is in Western society, a patriarchal construct designed to oppress us all, we pander to it and then now set it up on a pedestal. We accept its dodgy science that gender is innate and immutable, ignore research about child development, and then, most unforgivably, we do to our children exactly what we accuse other more primitive societies of having done. We sacrifice them on an altar of a belief, one that has been designed to affirm adults. True, we don't throw them down volcanoes or wells, or burn or bury them alive. Rather, we feed them to the gender transformation industry for a lifetime of medical interventions. This cannot be right.
Hi, thanks very much, Social Work Anonymous, for that contribution. There's a lot in there, and I think delegates will be able to see that it's all of that is in the briefing that we've produced, which Social Work Anon is a major author of, and Sarah has put up the details of how to access that briefing. So if there was a lot there to unpack, you can go and have a really good read of it and get more to grips with some of the concepts and that Andrew's arguing to us tonight. So our next speaker, so thanks very much, Social Work. And our next speaker is Shereen Benjamin, who's a senior lecturer in primary education at the University of Edinburgh. So I'm going to ask Shereen if she will now come on the screen and start her presentation. Thanks.
Okay, I think I've come on the screen. Can you let me know if I have? Great. And I'm also going to share my slides, so bear with me while I do that. Just getting the right slides up. Can you see my slides? I can't see if you can.
Yes, they can see.
Great, great. Okay, hello, thank you very much for inviting me this evening. I didn't actually know what Social Work Anon was going to say, but I am building quite well on what he was talking about. So I think in this audience, people are going to know there's been a lot of discussion in the media about schools and safeguarding and the legal implications of mixed-sex toilets and changing facilities and so on. We could spend all evening on that, but I'm not even going to touch on it, because what I want to talk about this evening is the school curriculum, what children are being taught, as the framing context in which we think about their capacity to consent to embarking on a medicalised pathway. But what I thought I'd start with is a story, because it's late in the evening, isn't it? It's a cold, wet day. So let's have a story. This comes from a picture book aimed at children under 8 called I Am Jazz. I think some of you will have heard of it. It's based on the experiences of Jazz Jennings, who transitioned at a very young age. And it's very widely recommended for use in primary schools, including by the Scottish Government in its guidance. So here's what I Am Jazz has to say. I am Jazz. For as long as I can remember, my favourite colour has been pink. My second favourite colour is silver, and my third favourite colour is green. My best friends are Samantha and Casey. We always have fun together. We like high heels and princess gowns or cartwheels and trampolines. But I'm not exactly like Samantha and Casey. I have a girl brain, but a boy body. This is called transgender. I was born this way. Remember, this is for children under 8. When I was very little, my mum would say, "You're such a good boy." I would say, "No, mama, good girl." At first, my family was confused. They always thought of me as a boy. As I got a little older, I hardly ever played with trucks or tools or superheroes, only princesses and mermaid costumes. My brothers told me this was girl stuff, but I kept right on playing. My sister said I was always talking to her about my girl thoughts and my girl dreams, and how one day I would be a beautiful lady. She would giggle and say, "You're a funny kid." Then one amazing day, everything changed. Mum and Dad took me to meet a new doctor who asked me lots and lots of questions. Afterward, the doctor spoke to my parents, and I heard the word transgender for the very first time. That night at bedtime, my parents both hugged me and said, "We understand now. Be who you are. We love you no matter what." That made me smile and smile and smile. And if you want to know what comes next, I'm afraid you're going to have to look it up on YouTube, where you can find it being read. So what does this have to do with consent? Well, I think we have to remember consent doesn't happen in a vacuum. Children's and adolescents' capacity to consent to interventions that are likely to set them on a medicalised pathway are contingent on their understanding of sex and gender, on how they see themselves as sexed and gendered people, and on what they think transition will offer them. And a lot of that understanding is developed as they engage with the school curriculum, because schools are important places. They're not the only places, but they are significant places where children learn about sex and gender identity. And I'm going to suggest 3 distinct modes of the curriculum. There's what we could call the formal curriculum, which is the knowledge and skills that teachers plan to teach via their lesson contact. So, for example, this week's lesson is on the water cycle. Then there's the informal curriculum, which tends to be the kind of habits, the dispositions, the values that schools and teachers aim to inculcate by their rules and their expectations, the way we do things around here. So, for instance, a school that thinks it's important to teach children to share might feature a lot of group work and conflict resolution and stuff like that. And then there's the null curriculum, which is what children pick up through what's left out or not said. So, for example, if learning always happens inside in the classroom, children may develop an unquestioned assumption that outdoors isn't a place for learning. So it's what you glean by what's left out. Now, here's a very complicated looking chart. Don't worry, I'll talk through it. I want you to imagine 2 schools where the teachers think about sex and gender identity in different ways. So in school A, which is the one on the left-hand side, teachers take what until recently would have been seen as a very progressive view, derived from feminism, and they believe in school A that sex is dimorphic and immutable, which is to say you're born male or female and you can't change sex, and that gender is socially produced, politically produced, the product of a complex history which has sustained male dominance and female subordination over millennia. And it includes the stereotypical roles and expectations that women and men learn to take up. In school B, on the other hand, the teachers believe that sex is a spectrum, it's assigned at birth, it can be changed, and that each individual has an innate gender identity which trumps sex when it comes to categorising that individual as a man, a woman, or something else. And as social worker Non says, there's no evidence for that, but many organisations, and I have to say many university departments of education, are increasingly promoting to schools and teachers this second way of understanding sex and gender identity as being unassailable and anything else as bigotry. So following on from their basic understanding of sex and gender, the teachers in school A believe that children become gendered, they learn to be gendered, and school is one place where it happens. So to oversimplify a lot and to add to what social worker Non was saying, the teachers in school A subscribe to an established view from social cognitive theory of gender development. So they believe children learn to be gendered. They move through the stages that social worker Non talked about in 3 major ways. First, through modelling, which is watching what older children and adults do and copying it. So, for example, boys coming into the infant school learn that playing football is mostly a boy thing because that's what they see on the playground. Secondly, through inactive experience, which is the feedback and the status children get from conforming or not conforming to gendered expectations. So this little boy who's come in and he's starting to play football and he's good at it, he finds he's rewarded by high standing in the peer group. And the third way is by direct tuition, which is adults telling children directly what's appropriate for them as boys and girls. So that's the view that teachers in school A have. They think children becoming gendered is a process and it's done to children, it's external. But in school B, the teachers believe that children are born with this gendered true self, which can reveal itself at any age. So Jazz in the story has this sense of being a girl from the outset and tells us, I have a girl brain but a boy body, I was born this way. And when she gets a bit older, we're told that Jazz has girl thoughts and girl dreams, whatever they are. So for teachers in school B, this is innate, it's inborn. The child is the only person who can possibly know whether their body and their gender identity are aligned. And these different understandings lead to different curricula. Teachers in school A will want to challenge the gendered expectations and the stereotypes that box in both girls and boys and that hold in place that hierarchy between male and female. So they'll do that in the formal curriculum, for example, by teaching children to notice and to critique gendered expectations. So for example, helping them to notice how toys are differently marketed to girls and boys. And in the informal curriculum, they might be doing that through supporting and enabling counter-stereotypical choices. So, for example, encouraging girls to be physically active and adventurous, and boys to be caring and nurturing. Teachers in school B won't be so interested in breaking down these gender boxes. What they'll want to do is help a few children move from one gender box to another, or into a third box labelled non-binary, in line with their perceived gender identity. And that's what they'll teach. Only you can know whether and decide whether you're a boy or a girl or something else. And that's where stories like I Am Jazz come in. And those teachers will want to create a climate in the school in which children, a few children, can change from one gender box to another. And as children get older, teachers in school A would probably be tackling, or the secondary counterpart of it, will be tackling some of the really tough issues for young women. So for example, looking at how they can navigate a porn-soaked culture, deal with harassment from boys. There'd probably be open discussion of why transition can be appealing as a potential escape from womanhood, drawing on the stories we're now hearing from detransitioners. So that would be critically discussed in school A. Whereas in school B, they'd be more likely to feature celebratory stories of children and young people embracing a trans or non-binary identity. So what I've talked about up to here is the curriculum as it applies to all children as they move through the school. And before I end, I want to touch briefly on the particular implications of that curriculum for the ways that schools and teachers respond to children who disclose distress as a result of gender nonconformity or trans identification. So in school A, teachers would listen to the child and support them without judgment. They'd want to discuss the child's situation with parents at the earliest possible opportunity and explore what changes could be made by the school to make a more supportive environment for the young person. So for instance, what can we do as a school to make it okay to be a gentle, studious boy who likes wearing pink and playing with princess clothes? So the response to a gender non-conforming boy in school A might be a teacher might say something like, we love and accept you how you are, we'll do what we can to make it okay for you to enjoy the things you like. Lots of other boys have felt this way, and most of them grow out of it when they're teenagers. A few of them decide they may need to be seen as women when they grow up, but that's a decision for when you're older. You don't need to think about it yet. So that's in school A. In school B, the starting point would be the same, listening and supporting without judgment. The two schools have that in common. But bear in mind, children in school B have now been taught that only they can possibly know whether they're a boy or a girl or something else, and that any adult who doesn't accept their gender identity unconditionally is acting out of hatred or bigotry. And that could include their parents. So it would be for the child to say whether they wanted their parents involved in any discussions and decisions. And the message from teachers to our gender non-conforming boy, if he was in school B, would be along the lines of, we love and accept you how you are. And if you're really a girl, we can treat you accordingly. And when you're a bit older, you'll be able to change your body so that it matches your true self. And that's how consent has been framed. It's not a neutral thing. It's based on what children have been taught. So let's imagine our two gender non-conforming boys have reached their early or their mid-teens. Boy A in school A has, maybe he's been diagnosed with gender dysphoria, maybe not. If he has, he'll have been told this may resolve. In most boys, it resolves. He's been told he can be whatever kind of boy he wants, and he probably only partly believes it because he lives in a very gendered world where the explicit messaging of the school is contradicted by so much else in the media and in his peer group and so on. But it's there in the background. And he's got an increasingly realistic view of what physical intervention will mean and what it can and can't do, that he won't literally ever be able to change sex. Boy B, on the other hand, believes that he's been born in the wrong body, which is what he's been taught, and that medical physical intervention is the only way he'll ever be able to look in a mirror and see a body that matches his true self, and that any adult who suggests anything else wants to hurt him. He also thinks that medical intervention will mean literally changing sex, or he might articulate that by now as in becoming the sex he truly is. Now, School A and School B are caricatures, they're extremes, and in most schools there's actually some degree of contradiction because neither of these ideologies are bedded in, and a lot of schools haven't thought about it at all. But I think what we're seeing is that teachers are worried. We all know this is a high stakes debate going on, and teachers are worried about making mistakes in this area, and more of them are getting their information and their training from organisations who tell them that the School B model, accepting gender identity ideology as the truth and unassailable, that's the only inclusive way forward and anything else is damaging for children. And that has profound implications for the context in which children reach the point where they could be making potentially life-altering decisions about their futures. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks very much, Shereen. That was excellent. And I'm so glad you're teaching teachers in Scotland to teach, and I hope that they're all going to teach in type A schools, which is what we need. So thanks. I'm now going to hand over to Sarah Phillimore. Now, Sarah has been a family law barrister for over 20 years, and she runs the Child Protection Resource website. So Sarah's going to speak to us, obviously, about the law and legal matters associated with this. And she has also contributed to the briefing that we have published with TransgenderTrend. So on you go, Sarah.
Thanks very much, Maggie. I'll just start by checking. Hopefully you can see and hear me. Let me know if you can't. I'm also going to be very brave tonight. Thank you to Shereen for giving me this bravery. I'm going to try and share my screen. So let's do that now, because I've put again the link in the chat to our explainer, which very grateful thanks to Stephanie from TransgenderTrend. She produced a very professional looking PDF. And what we want to do is to get this printed on some nice glossy paper and send it to every MP, every police and crime commissioner, every head teacher, anyone you could think of that would find it useful. So part of what we are doing is not merely trying to spread information by way of this webinar, but also asking by way of a crowdfunder if you'd be willing to donate to make that happen. So we'll set that up after the webinar. But just to let you know, this is the document that we're going to try and circulate. What we've tried to do is clearly set out as simply as possible what's going on in this area. So you see, we start with a summary. Then we've got social work anon, a précis of what he was talking about. But of course, a key part of what's going on is the law. And that's what I just wanted to talk about briefly. I'm not going to go into great detail. If you want more detail, you can see we set out at part 2 of our PDF explainer, what is the legal test for a child to consent to medical treatment? And this has been really interesting for me as a lawyer, seeing so much discussion of Gillick competence online. And what's really struck me is the lack of understanding of Gillick competence and really the hostility towards it. And I think that's not because Gillick competence is a redundant or a harmful principle. It's not, it's entirely uncontroversial. It simply says we need to respect the autonomy of the growing child. We shouldn't force decisions on children who are of sufficient age and understanding to make a choice for themselves. Gillick is not the problem here. It's the application of Gillick that is the problem, the failure of professionals to properly assess if children actually do understand what they're getting themselves into. So the explainer tries to set out, well, what is this legal test? Where did it come from? It came from the wish of Mrs. Gillick to stop any of her daughters getting access to contraception when they were under 16, on the not unreasonable proposition that the age of consent to sexual intercourse is 16. So the question was, were the doctors, if they prescribed the pill, participating in unlawful activity? And it's well worth a read. Go back to basics, see what their lordships were saying about the diminishing power of the parental veto. So Gillick is not the problem. The problem is this, we'll see at section 3, examination of the environment in which the legal test operates. And Shereen has given you already a very clear and troubling overview of how this might be operating in schools. And those of you who've been following the Helen Webberley Tribunal tweets will also now have quite a shocking understanding of the environment in which a lot of doctors are operating. We've seen evidence from 2 doctors now in support of Dr. Webberley to say they don't bother asking about consent, because why? Why would you ask a child to tell you what they explain about their beautiful transition into a wonderful butterfly? We don't sully this with ridiculous questions. The treatment itself is being said to be straightforward. So again, there's no need to bother the child with lots of questions about loss of sexual function or fertility, because they can just go ahead and say yes. And this for me is probably the key element of what's going on and what we need to change, is how social workers and teachers and parents are going to be able to challenge this environment, which is saying in terms that the treatment is not merely harmless, it's necessary, because otherwise the children will kill themselves. So that's what's happened. Gillick has been utterly subverted and corrupted, basically because children aren't being properly assessed. You'll remember the evidence of the Tavistock in the first court decision in Bell, and that was quite horrifying to me. There didn't seem to be any records kept of the children's ability to consent. It seemed every single child who came through the doors was deemed to be Gillick competent, and that just can't be right, particularly not when the youngest child referred for puberty blockers at the Tavistock was 10 years old. So we talk about the various elements which are operating to produce this, I think, really pernicious environment. And sadly, it has extended to the courts. And you'll be aware there was a recent case, seeing I'm scrolling down, see if I can find it, which TransgenderTrend have written about, and I've also written about, where a High Court judge found there to be nothing at all alarming or surprising in the fact that 2 unrelated children in the same foster placement expressed a wish to transition at the ages of 4 and 7. Now, it was Dr. Petersky giving evidence in that case, and we've just now been able to see from her evidence at the tribunal what she thinks about that. And she said in terms, she sees no difference between a child of 16 and an adult of 40. So this is the really, really worrying environment. And of course, our webinar tonight's been extremely timely, and I was hoping that this would happen. While we were preparing it and writing our explainer, the judgment dropped from the Court of Appeal. And you, of course, will recall what the Court of Appeal did. They took the High Court declarations, which we can see set out here with the bullet points. These are the things that children have to understand. And I think it's highly unlikely, although not impossible, but highly unlikely that a child under 12 is going to understand any of this. And I think pretty unlikely between the ages of 12 and 16. So the Court of Appeal said that that was something the High Court couldn't have done, not because it's found that transition was unproblematic or there was a huge evidence base for it. Quite the contrary. The Court of Appeal said in terms that this is difficult and controversial treatment, and it batted back the responsibility to the clinicians, saying you are the ones who must make sure that these children can understand all these difficult areas. You are the ones who are tasked with the job of assessing Gillick competence. And quite a lot of commentators have been stating on social media, and I agree with them, that this is opening the door to medical negligence actions. And it would indeed be a really sad and twisted irony if the people who actually stop this being done to children are insurance companies. But I think it might well be. So the Court of Appeal not upholding the High Court was not the massive victory that I know a lot of commentators have claimed. I think it was a careful restatement of the limitations of judicial review. And it also was very clear to send back to the clinicians the message that they must do their job. So I'm really pleased to be part of this kind of webinar, because I think that this is what we need to carry away from this. We need to continue the conversation. We need to share the information. We need to empower ourselves to be able to challenge the doctor or the teacher or the social worker who says that this is entirely unproblematic, that we don't need to investigate a child's circumstances. We don't need to bother ourselves about whether they really understand the consequences for their adult self. So I'm really pleased and grateful that people have come tonight, and I hope this is of some interest and use to you. And hopefully we will be broadcasting soon the ways in which you can help us raise some money to get our explainer sent around to people who probably haven't been able to wrap their heads around what's going on yet. So thank you very much for that opportunity. Sorry, Maggie, I wasn't keeping a careful look at the time, but hopefully I haven't gone over. In fact, I think I've been quite abstemious and gone under. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And yes, you definitely are well within time. So thank you very much for that. I think it helped. It was very, very clear, and I think makes the duties of social workers in face with the Keira Bell, the appeal ruling, very, very clear that we must protect children, and we must not go along with the automatic transition argument. Now, the next speaker, so thank you, Sarah, and the next speaker that we have is Stephanie Davies-Arai. Now, Stephanie of TransgenderTrend, that I think all of us will know about, when I started worrying about these issues and what was happening to children, and looked around for any information or help or critical thought, and there was TransgenderTrend, because Stephanie had got there I think maybe years before a lot of us. So we're honoured to have Stephanie here tonight to speak at our first webinar. Stephanie, as well as being the founder and director of TransgenderTrend, is a communication skills trainer with over 20 years experience of working with parents and teachers. And I think it shows in the quality of TransgenderTrend's work. So I'm now going to hand over to Stephanie to make the last presentation of the evening, and before we go into questions and discussions.
Thank you, Maggie, and thanks to EBSWA for running this webinar and for inviting me. I'm really thrilled to be here. So I'm going to go straight into the appeal judgment, which passed responsibility for obtaining informed consent from children for puberty blockers back to the clinical and medical professionals in line with the original Gillick case. But there are factors which make the case of puberty blockers for gender dysphoria unique and unprecedented, as it is a unique case in medicine. For no other condition does a child have their self-diagnosis essentially accepted at face value, their rejection of their body and their sex affirmed, and cosmetic change of the healthy body prescribed as a cure for what is a psychological issue. So the appeal court judgment raises more questions than answers, which I'm going to ask now. Point 93 of the judgment stresses that it is for the clinicians to exercise their judgment, knowing how important it is that consent is properly obtained according to the particular individual circumstances as envisaged by Gillick, and by reference to developing understanding in this, quote, difficult and controversial area. And it adds the clinicians are subject to professional regulation and oversight. Now this may be, and certainly should be the case, but this is the system that failed Keira Bell and many others like her, as we know from the increasing number of social media accounts and testimonies of other young people who regret their medical transition, mostly young women. So in this case, we have to ask, can we rely on the judgment of clinical professionals and regulators if the rationale for medical intervention is based on an ideology rather than clinical evidence? The Tavistock and Portman NHS Foundation Trust is a member of the Stonewall Diversity Champions Scheme, as is the Care Quality Commission, the regulator. And the Tavistock Gender Identity Development Service, GIDS, operates an affirmation approach towards children who self-identify as transgender, in line with the demands of the gender activist lobby, and not through clinical evidence that this approach is effective in treating gender dysphoria or is even safe. So affirmation precludes any other option for treatment other than the medical pathway, beginning with puberty blockers and progressing to cross-sex hormones. Affirmation of self-diagnosis is just unheard of for any other condition. And particularly, can you imagine a doctor agreeing with a patient who said, I learned about it on the internet? Transgender is not a medical term or diagnosis. It's rather a political term with an incoherent and constantly expanding definition, from cross-dressers to those who do not conform to traditional gender norms. That's according to Gendered Intelligence. So although the Tavistock acknowledges themselves that this is a difficult and controversial area, this is not reflected in their treatment protocols, which are based on a belief in one side of the controversy. The belief in gender identity ideology is also reflected in the language of the NHS service specification itself for children and adolescents. A belief in an ideology is like a faith. By definition, it requires no evidence, as noted by the original Kirabel Judicial Review, where the judges were continually surprised by the Tavistock's lack of data. So can those who believe in one side of a controversial issue be impartial enough to give children the information they need in order to be able to give informed consent? I once asked Polly Carmichael, the director of GIDS, if she informed adolescent girls of the feminist theory of gender as a hierarchy, and she appeared to be confused by that question. And I followed up with an email, which she didn't answer. So I presume that means no. Adolescents are not informed of other beliefs about gender, or even that they exist. And without this information, cannot be said to be fully informed. Typically, when there is a belief in an ideology, evidence for that belief is taken seriously and evidence against is dismissed. So this bias will inevitably be passed on to children, and this may result in the sharing of misleading information. Gary Butler, when talking about the issue of fertility, stated, this understanding must include that they are unable to have the typical sexual relationship of their identified gender with another person on account of their biological sex organ development, and that other surgical procedures may be necessary later on to achieve that possibility. Well, in fact, it will never be possible to have the typical sexual relationship with surgically constructed genitalia of the opposite sex, which will never function as natural sex organs do. And this is why it's so important that paediatric medical practitioners make every effort to discard personal views when listening to children. If the Tavistock GIDS were neutral, they would be offering therapeutic support to really get to the bottom of what is driving each individual child to reject their bodies and assess the best treatment pathway for them. And instead, the adherence to a set of beliefs results in an amazing lack of curiosity about individual children's circumstances and any factors which may be found to be causative of the gender dysphoria. In sessions at the Tavistock, the GIDS failed to uncover the factors underlying Kira Bell's identification as a boy, such as mental health issues and struggles with her sexuality. In an interview, it was in January, on the Channel 4 show Steph's Packed Lunch, Kira Bell described these sessions as very brief appointments, just kind of what was my friendship group like as I was growing up? Did I prefer to hang out with boys or girls? What did I like to wear? My hobbies, that sort of thing. So it's very much based on stereotypes and no psychiatric assessment or anything like that. I don't think children can consent to puberty blockers because I don't think they are being given all the information they need in order to give that consent, nor do I believe that adolescents are developmentally capable of understanding all the relevant information, even if it was given to them. Children are influenced mainly by the parents or primary caregivers. Adolescents are influenced mainly by the peer group and popular culture. To unpick these influences and reach a point where you know what you believe doesn't just take maturity, it takes time. And children and adolescents have not yet had that time. The affirmation approach itself is incompatible with informed consent. Unless children are shown different ways of conceptualizing their distress and discomfort with their bodies and offered alternative ways of understanding themselves, they cannot be said to be fully informed. An adolescent girl today is inundated with messages about gender identity on social media, taught gender identity as fact in school, and arrives at the JIDS fully convinced that she's really a boy. And there she will only have her belief validated and reinforced by a clinical service enthralled to the same belief. My intervention in the original Kira Bell review addressed this specific cultural environment that this generation of children is growing up in. I can't remember a time when any other ideological belief has been so aggressively promoted to children and young people. And this is fueled, of course, by the internet and social media, and now reinforced in schools. So the change from the medical profession's understanding of a child as being gender dysphoric to a child who is transgender has politicized these children as a marginalized group with rights, rather than a group of adolescents struggling with identity and their place in the world. It has also gender neutralized the group, so that gender dysphoria in girls is not viewed within a framework of female adolescent mental health, but through the lens of transgender health. And through this lens, it's clear why the Tavistock JIDS is unable to hypothesize why there has been such a spike in referrals of teenage girls to the clinic, and therefore they're unable to investigate underlying issues, such as the kind of body hatred and dysmorphia not uncommon, unfortunately, in teenage girls. And nor can they take into account adolescent girls' social media use and particular susceptibility to the influence of body shaming messages and the pressure to fit an impossible ideal of femininity, not to mention the impact of violent pornography on this generation of girls' lives. So the information an adolescent needs in order to be able to give fully informed consent to having their puberty medically blocked is perhaps far too wide-ranging to fit the remit of the original Gillick judgment as it was originally envisaged. And it involves a level of self-knowledge and understanding not yet achieved in the teenage years. So where do we go from here? My feeling is that the appeal judgment actually changes nothing. The world was changed by the Kira Bell judgment. The appeal court did not overturn the findings of that judgment, that this is an experimental treatment with no evidence to support it, and with known and unknown long-term harmful results. So all of that information was put out into the world in the Kira Bell judicial review. That hasn't been disputed by the appeal. The only dispute is who actually whose responsibility it is to get informed consent from children. So I feel the initial JR, the genie is out of the bottle and it won't go back in. My hope is that with this decision that it's put back to the clinical professionals, that the CAS review, what I hope the CAS review will achieve will be a truly neutral service for children with gender dysphoria, a service where the individual child is prioritised above an ideology. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Stephanie. Just as we hoped and expected, a really clear and interesting view of the Kira Bell ruling, but also of the disappearance of feminism and of understandings of children's experience in life today, and the things that made many of our generation feminists, and they've now somehow, but they've lost access to all of that with this ideological promotion of gender identity instead of enlightenment and understanding. Anyway, we have, so thanks very much, Stephanie. Everybody's kept really good time, and so we're going to have a good more than 30 minutes for questions and discussion, and we already have 2 or 3 questions in. So without more ado, I'm going to move over to the questions and ask, I think the first one was for Sarah, which was, does the original court judgment list of things that the child must understand or retain or weigh in order to consent still stand? I think Stephanie's kind of answered that, but you might, do clinicians, the question is, have to evidence this now in their capacity assessment?
Sorry, frog in my throat. What's happened is the court was making declarations.
I'll go to somebody else and then you have a drink of water. Right. So, Shereen, the next question is for you then, and then we'll go back to Sarah when she's had a drink. And that, Shereen, is in school type B, how much of this belief in gender identity is taught via PSHE lessons, and how do we, 1, find out the contents of these lessons, and 2, challenge them?
Okay, so I'm assuming from the terminology this is a secondary school question. It'll be taught against, it'll be spread across sex and relationships education, which tends to be used now rather than PHSE. It's probably also, some of it is happening in LGBT plus clubs, which are springing up in schools as places of informal education and allyship. So there will be some informal work going on. And it may be happening in form tutor time. So I would always say start with your child's form tutor, or whatever the equivalent is in your school, because then you're likely to, most schools have a few teachers who are totally bought into the ideology, a few teachers who are opposed to it, and most who are kind of treading a balancing line and don't really get it and know that it's all terribly toxic. If you go to your school's form tutor, you're more likely to get somebody who isn't totally bought into it. If you go to the SRE coordinator, you're more likely, there are some who aren't bought into it, but you could be more likely to get somebody who is. So I would start with the form tutor. Ask what's being taught, ask how children are being taught about sex and gender, ask about LGBT education, because there's been a lot of forced teaming. And a lot of us have been working for years and years and years to get decent role models and decent images of lesbian, gay and bisexual people into schools. And we're really working hard to destigmatize LGBT lives and choices. And that the gender identity ideology is quite often worked in with LGBT education. So ask about LGBT education as well as what's being taught about gender. I would ask to see any written schemes of work that the school's using. Ask if they're using any published guidance. So they might be, if it's Scotland, they might be using the Scottish government's guidance for transgender children, as it's called. They might be using guidance produced by other organisations. They might be using Pop and Ollie's resources, but ask what published resources, if any, they're using. And ask who is training the teachers. Ask where teachers are getting their information from. Because if you've got Stonewall coming in, or if you're in Scotland, LGBT Youth Scotland, they will be presenting gender ideology as if it's an unassailable fact, and that teachers have to teach that, or else they're being bigoted and hateful and children will die. So it's important to know where teachers are getting their information from, I think. So I would start with form tutors. If you get nowhere, go straight to the head teacher and find out what's happening from the head teacher.
Right, thanks, Sarah. Good advice. Shereen, sorry. Thanks, Shereen. Sarah, are you ready to come in now on your
I think
question?
I've got my voice back. Thank you. Yes, it's really interesting because the Court of Appeal judgment was very technical, very legalistic. It was about the limits of judicial review. Judges are allowed to make observations. They make them all the time. Lords Fraser and Scarman and Gillick made lots of observations, but they didn't claim that these were declarations of law binding on the doctors. And that's where the High Court stepped out of line, not because their observations were in any way unreasonable. In fact, I think exactly as Stephanie says, the reason this judgment reverberated around the world was because the High Court was saying what everyone was thinking, that you cannot have a 12-year-old able to consent to giving up their future capacity to have an orgasm and to have children. And remember, the Tavistock submitted evidence that they thought helped them. From, I think, a 12 or a 13-year-old child, when asked about relationships, effectively said, ew, I don't want to have to think about that. I'm only 12. The Tavistock thought this was actually evidence that helped them. So, but anyway, so the High Court set out what I think anyone with half a brain would see as reasonable and true. But the mistake they made was to put it in the form of a legally binding declaration, which doctors would have to abide by and then have to come to court to justify their decision. And the Court of Appeal said, no, you cannot do this in a judicial review. That is an unacceptable fetter on Gillick competence. So they batted it back to the doctors. But I think the key point, I think Stephanie is absolutely right. It's wrong to call this a defeat or a victory. The real victory was the High Court hearing. The real victory is that we are here tonight talking about this and recognizing what is real and what is true. So I see the Court of Appeal as simply trying to restore control, restore the parameters of a judicial review and what it can achieve. And I think it's very useful for me because I love lawfare as a weapon. Some of the most significant victories we've achieved have been in the courts. But the whole Bell case has showed us the limitations of lawfare as a tool for achieving real and lasting change. Because I think it's something the Court of Appeal said in their very first paragraph. We can only decide the case that is in front of us. It is not appropriate to use the Court of Appeal as some sort of mechanism for determining standards of treatment for children up and down the country. And that's where the Cass review will come in, because the Cass review could provide that foundation. And happily, because of the very hard work of Kira Bell and Stephanie, for whom I'm eternally grateful, the Cass review is now operating in a field of irrationality and sense. Whereas if they'd started their work 3 years ago, I would be very, very worried about what would be coming out at the other end. So I hope that's clear. I think the Court of Appeal judgment is pretty clear and accessible for a layperson. So if you're still stumbling over that concept, have another read of the judgment and hopefully you'll see what I see. And I think calls of it, people dancing around and jubilating like Pink News saying that this was an utter victory, it simply shows just how arid and corrupted this debate has become and how unable many people are, I think, to actually just think about what is happening. Sorry, so I hope that makes sense and I've got my voice back.
Great, thanks. Yeah, you did get your voice back. That was fine. Thanks very much. There was actually a question come up. People are putting questions now into the question and answer box, which is better than the chat box if you're doing that, because the chat box is really quite busy. There's a lively discussion going on there. So in the question and answer box, we've got some questions. And the first of them was actually about the Cass review and how to, I suppose, influence that or to make sure that it does be, create this, what Sarah talked, or no, actually it was Stephanie, about a proper neutral service for children experiencing gender dysphoria and unhappiness. So does anybody of the panelists want to, is Social Work Anonymous around? Because
I am, yes. So I can say that EBSWA, two representatives of EBSWA, one being myself, one being another person who I won't name because she hasn't given me permission yet, spoke to Hilary Cass, and as part of the review process, we spent an hour talking. Very interesting and informative conversation, which I can't really talk too much about at this point, but they are listening, I would say, and they are interested in what all sides have got to say. So I was heartened by the process. Being heartened by the process doesn't mean we will get what we want out of the process, but the process is there, and it was good to be part of it and be invited And there are ongoing panel discussions as well, which some of us have been invited to as well. So I think they are determined to listen to all sides of what is going on. And I can say that I put to the CAS review was about child development and about the importance, of realizing that there was no evidence for gender identity, as I was saying in my talk, about the immutable gender, innate gender identity. There is no evidence for it, whereas tons of evidence for children's sense of their gender changing as their cognitive processes change. So that's kind of the thing. And the other person who was part of it put her positions very, very powerfully indeed as well. So I think we've made some contributions, but everyone else is making contributions. So that's kind of where it is.
Thanks very much. Now there's quite a cluster of questions coming in, and one of these, which I think could either be Stephanie or Shereen, but I'll ask Stephanie in the first place, and that is about consent issues with social transition. That teachers heard from teachers that schools are assuming social transition, which sometimes includes binders, is the only appropriate response to a child who says they're trans, and issues about the parents not being told. Does this have similar consent problems to medical steps in relation to children when it's happening in school, or are the obligations on schools different? So the schools seem to assume that this is not medical treatment, even if they're recommending or encouraging binders. Do you want to take that, Stephanie?
Yes, schools are encouraged to believe that social transitioning is kind and affirmation is kind. And in fact, affirmation and social transition are really strong psychological interventions. And what teachers don't realize is that affirmation is an activist approach. There isn't evidence to show that affirmation and social transition is safe. And in fact, the evidence that we have from a study in the Netherlands by Dr. Thomas Steensma shows that social transition is the strongest indicator of persistence of gender dysphoria. But of course, because this kind of information is not distributed by the trans activist lobby groups that go into schools, then teachers are not aware of this. And so the issue is affirmation and social transition. To me, that is a very specific approach which should be determined by clinical professionals or professionals in the counselling and therapy world. It's not something that can be determined by teachers who are not qualified to say this is the best treatment for this child.
Thanks. Yeah, that was a really useful question, I think, because there is such a focus on schools. There's a question that's come in that's about over 18s saying, how do we protect them? And obviously that is a really important question. I'm going to say, though, that this session was particularly about children, and we plan to have another second webinar with a detransitioning young person to speak along with Stella O'Malley from GenSpect. So I think that session might very well be able to deal with the over 18s, detransitioning, and those. But unless any of the panel want to take that one on right now, I would move on to, there's a question about on any evidence about girls transitioning or wanting to transition and sexual abuse. Does anybody have anything to say on research on that or any evidence about that?
So yes, there was, I know of one research study that looking at comorbidities of children generally and transitioning, where it was 10% of children, not specifically girls, who were sexually abused in the past. And I think if you go back, it was always one of the factors that would be considered by professionals working in this area, that a child had perhaps suffered previous trauma, sexual abuse, family dynamics. These were all the kind of issues that may lead to cross-sex identification, and they were they were all considered. And now, of course, affirmation prevents the consideration of those underlying issues.
Thanks very much, Stephanie. There's questions are flooding in now, and I'm trying to pick out, you know, some slightly different ones. That one was for Sarah, actually, again, and that is, can the Court of Appeal decision help Scotland? We've got quite a lot of contributors from Scotland tonight, our audience from Scotland tonight, and there's a few Scottish specific questions, but I think that one might be the most relevant one, or the most interesting one for us.
Yeah, it's really tricky. I mean, I'll have to confess, I don't fully understand the position vis-a-vis England and Scotland. Some powers are devolved entirely to Scotland, but others are not. The Equality Act, as I understand it, is a UK-wide piece of legislation, so Scotland cannot devolve from that. I think the bottom line is decisions in jurisdictions which we trust, common law jurisdictions, Commonwealth countries, Canada, America, we trust these decisions. A Scottish court may not be directly bound by the decision of an English court, but I don't think they can just casually disregard it. They may have to find some way of at least finessing it or commenting upon it. But there is a possibility that we will end up in the ludicrous situation of two jurisdictions that share a land border diverging on some really important points of policy and law. And I certainly think, from what I know of Scotland, they are galloping ahead in a way that is very worrying. But you can see how the High Court judgment was, I mean, I delivered a talk to a conference organised by Australian lawyers. Australia thinks cross-sex hormones are therapeutic treatment. Now, the looks on their faces as I went through what the High Court was saying were pained. But I think it was a miracle that I was allowed to give that presentation, you know, given how embedded it was in Australian culture. Then a couple of months later, we saw that some states in Australia were actually raising questions and saying, hang on a minute. So of course, they were watching very carefully what the High Court in England were saying. I mean, this isn't just some little magistrates court, district judge court. This is a senior court of England and Wales. So its judgment may not be directly binding, but it's got to be listened to. But I think one of the really worrying things is just how much Scotland is going to diverge. And we have to keep an eye on that. But I think they would ignore, the High Court, they would ignore the Cass Review at their peril. I don't think the Cass Review does extend to Scotland, but clearly its findings have got to be relevant. So yeah, it is all quite complicated about what's binding and what's not, but certainly what we're doing in England has got to be persuasive over the border, unless of course Scotland has gone completely mad, which the signs are not encouraging, but I hope it hasn't gone completely mad.
It does feel as if we have at times gone completely over the cliff, but I think that those of us in Scotland will need to work hard to ensure and put pressure on our medical establishment up here to pay attention to the Cass Review, and perhaps we will be able to do that, and rather than just directly attacking Parliament over it. Stephanie, you wanted to come in there. Unmute.
Sorry, just a very quick point that the NHS cannot go back to how it was before after the Bell ruling, and they haven't made an announcement, as they did very quickly after the Bell ruling. They cannot go back to how things were, so it would be very odd if NHS England and NHS Scotland were providing completely different services. The NHS will have to get its act together across the whole of the UK.
Thanks. We've had another question that's just come in that's general, I think maybe for Shereen, which is how do we support or respond to gender non-conforming children in a way that affirms their unique personalities while not sending them down a transition path?
Oh, that's an interesting question. If I can answer it in relation to schools, and maybe one of the others can do it in relation to families. I'm not sure whether the question was meant for schools or beyond that, but I think it's a really interesting one for schools, because it used to be the progressive way that teachers thought about children who were struggling to fit in for any reason was the kind of central tenet of inclusive education was you change the environment around the child, you don't try and fix the child, which draws from the social model of disability. So the reason disabled people couldn't get around cities was because buses weren't accessible. Change the buses, make buses accessible, don't try and fix the disabled person. And that thinking was then incorporated into schools at the end of the 90s and for the first decade of the 2000s. With varying degrees of success, it has to be said. But what you do is you change the environment around the child. You don't try and fix the child. You don't treat the child as if they're a deficit. So in schools, what you would be thinking is, okay, if this little boy is getting his head kicked in because he's a gentle, studious boy and he's getting the piss ripped out of him for being gay, even though he's too young to understand what any of that means, what you do is you work with all the children in the school to change the culture, change the peer group culture, to try to make things a bit less macho among the boys. How can we make it? I worked with a lovely primary school in quite a difficult area with some really tough macho boys, particularly towards the top of the primary age range, and they managed to get to a point where there were big TEDs scattered throughout the school that children could go to if they had a meltdown, and even the alpha males in primary 7 would go and cuddle with Big Ted when they lost their temper. So part of it for schools, I think, is getting back to what we know and what schools have been implementing with children with various difficulties, that you change the environment around the child, therefore the child sticks out rather less, so that it becomes more normal to be a gentle, studious boy or a physically active, assertive girl, that it becomes something that's desirable. It gives you status in the peer group, which, try being a little boy who's useless at football and hates physical activity. You're at the bottom of the pecking order. So, the best support for that schools can offer in that kind of situation is to try to make the school less demanding, less pigeonholing of children in relation to gender anyway, and try to open up those boxes. Remember I said children get boxed in by gendered expectations, and good schools realise that. So what a good school will do is try to expand the space in the box. You can't jump from one sexed box to another, but you can make the box so capacious that actually it doesn't constrain children in the same way. So I suppose that's what I'd say to schools. I think probably one of the others can better answer it in relation to outside of a school context.
Well, yes, but actually I think that's probably very good advice for everybody. It's good advice for families, that if you've got a child who's try and change their environment both at home if you can, but also in their wider social circle, try and influence the environment. So don't try and change the child, or which is of course exactly what transitioning is doing. But maybe social worker Non would like to come in on that.
Yeah, I got nothing really to add, in the sense that, I think it's really crucial for children to understand that gender is a social construct. It's not innate with them, it's not immutable, it's something which is outside them, which impacts on them. And I think it's hard to understand that, particularly when there's so much pressure on them around this issue. But I think that's the kind of, those are the beginnings of conversations. And for a gender non-conforming child, it's really important to have these conversations about the social construction of gender, and that we live in a patriarchal society, and about hierarchies and all that stuff. So it's removing the, as I say, the focus on the child to saying that this is a response, and there's a good response to the terrible kind of like society we live in, and the gender construct we have created. Anyway, that's.
Yeah, thanks. I think pretty similar advice and thoughts about the importance of opening the boxes and not putting children into very rigid, stereotype boxes, which we've seen is pretty much the basis for the case for gender identity. So other questions that have come in, one was about, actually from Marion Miller in Scotland, who's one of our sisters up here, who's facing really prosecution on the basis of tying a ribbon on railings, and the activist who reported her to the police for hate crime got responded to immensely quickly in a way that we know women are not responded to, and that the rape threats and death threats and all God knows what else threats against J.K. Rowling, for instance, didn't merit that response. So welcome, Marion. I'm glad to see you here tonight. Marion's question was, would you advise parents should withdraw their children from school if the curriculum is, if they find the curriculum is not, is school B? I don't know who would want to answer that.
Shall I have a go? I would hope that would be a very, 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 very last resort. I'm horrified at the idea that any parent would be forced to remove their child from a school. So if you're so worried about what's being taught, and you've tried to engage the school, you've tried talking to the head teacher, you've tried talking to the governors, you've tried working with other parents to see if, in partnership with the school, you can get some kind of change. As a very last resort, if they're still determined to teach gender identity ideology uncritically, then yes, that is your last resort. I would really hope that parents aren't forced into that. That I think is horrendous. The Scottish government guidance, they're a piece of work, aren't they, the Scottish government? So it's non-statutory. They're having it both ways. The guidance is non-statutory. No school has to follow it. So the government kind of washes its hands of any responsibility, anything that goes wrong. But it's there, it's published, they've endorsed it. So schools are put in this awful position. And I do have sympathy for head teachers trying to negotiate all of that, because they're told on the one hand, the terrible statistics that are bandied about suicide rates that really scare teachers. Teachers want to do the best for children. So they're told this is all terribly worrying and you could do real damage to children, which teachers don't want to do on the one hand. And then they're given this guidance, but it's not statutory, so they don't have to follow it. But if you're told enough, this is a scary area, then you will follow it. So what I would really say is work with your school as far as you can. And not very many schools are totally captured, some more than others, but not many are totally captured. If you go in, if you get other parents to work with you, with the school, you can often make a difference. And if you ask some key questions, and a really good question, which ties in with the theme of this webinar, is show me the evidence. Can you give me the evidence, head teacher, chair of governors? Can you give me the evidence for why you need to teach my children that gender identity is innate? Can you give me the evidence that there is such a thing as gender identity and it's fixed and immutable? Can you give me the evidence that children can change sex? If that's what you're telling my children, give me the evidence base on which that you're using to come to the conclusion that this is a good thing to teach children. And you'll quite often find, if you ask that question, teachers are willing to think about it. So I would really hope that in your school you can work a bit more productively with teachers. But yeah, as a last resort, if you absolutely have to, if they're saying we're following the Scottish Government guidance to the letter, and we're going to have Stonewall Scotland coming in and LGBTU Scotland, and we're having all these charter marks, we're going to work towards getting them, and nothing you can do or say will make any change, then yeah, that is your last resort. But God, I'm horrified at the prospect that that has to happen.
Yeah, thanks, Shereen. And now another question, which I don't know if the panel will be able to answer it, but are social workers being uncritically taught gender ideology in their training courses now? What's actually being trained? We do actually have some academic members, but I'm not sure they can't, they can maybe type the answer to that in the question and answers, or unless any of the panel want to take that one on.
Maggie, I'm going to have to admit I was typing an answer to something somebody put in the chat. Can you repeat the question?
It was about whether social workers are uncritically taught gender ideology in their training courses. I imagine it is a bit like your situation in education, that I imagine that there will be a range of views. I know my husband is very gender critical and against it, and he was till recently teaching on a course and would not have countenanced teaching that, but some of his colleagues might accept it as true, or might just be keeping their heads well down at the University of Edinburgh in particular.
My knowledge that, which comes from being in a university department, I'm in a Department of Education, but we work with the social work department. It's getting harder. It's getting much, much harder to hold the line. I've been quietly dropped from a lot of courses, and my colleagues panic if I do teach something, and then you get I'm increasingly getting pushback from students, and my colleagues panic. And so, if you get that pushback, then they get the TIE campaign in to do a kind of counter presentation. So I think it's getting harder, but social worker Non might know more than me.
I don't. I would say, like, with my training, each university, each one is different, so I couldn't comment up to date about what's happening.
Okay. Thanks. We've now reached 2026, 4 minutes before the end. So I think that we'll draw the questions to a close there. Have any of the panelists got anything they feel has not been said that should be said before we close? No, he suddenly appeared on the screen. Well, I'll just maybe talk a bit about, or say a bit about what we hope will happen. We're hoping to put a lot of pressure on Social Work England, who seem at the moment, as far as we know, to be alone among the regulators in actually investigating and disciplining social workers for just holding gender critical views. And in fact, there is the one social worker who was actually sanctioned. But it's terrifying for people like me who are not employed by MD. I work independently, I'm semi-retired, I can speak out, so can others. But if you're at the start of your career or in mid-career, it is terrifying to think that you could be, if you're investigated, you can be suspended from work. And that is the punishment, and it can go on for a long time. So we really have to crack this and make Social Work England retract and withdraw. And I think victories like that will really help when we do that. So I think we'll be communicating with people. Please do join or support EBSWA and get into communication with us so that we can actually influence these bigger institutions. We need to be stronger, and we need everybody who can speak out or can do whatever to be doing it. The next webinar, we're planning to have quite a lot of this. I think it's been successful. There's lots of lively chat and good questions, and we're planning to have regular webinars. Stella O'Malley has agreed to speak at one on the 30th of October, which is a Saturday, where we'll probably hold it in the afternoon. We've got to get the details about that, but that will probably be our next event. And I think now all that's left for me to do is, on everybody's behalf, to thank all of our speakers. You've all been really clear, well informed, on the ball, and I think it's been a really successful discussion. So thanks to the speakers, and thanks to everyone else, everybody here in the audience, for your participation and your good questions and the really lively chat. So thanks very much, everybody, and good evening. Bye.